Okay. All right. So now I'm going to share my screen, and you should be able to see the slides. Okay. The opening.
Yes, I can see everything.
Okay. Good. All right. So uh, what I want to talk about is a new software tool that I've adapted from one developed first in Massachusetts, which allows us to see how the grid will actually work as we decarbonize it. It provides information that no other software that I'm aware of has provided, and will provide us some insights that are truly important in uh, planning for a decarbonized grid. So let's let's here go. Here's we're operating. I'm focusing on New York State. New York operates under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the CLCPA, passed now almost 5 years ago. It sets a series of goals. There was no plan in place, or had been developed by anyone to achieve these goals. Uh, so, in fact, under the law, the state set up a climate action council to develop a plan to achieve them. The principal goals of interest here are by 2030 to have all of the electricity in the state, or 70% of the electricity, from renewable energy, principally water power, solar, and wind. By 2040, to have the grid completely free of greenhouse gas emissions, carbon free. Uh, that is no use of fossil fuels to make electricity. Now, that's not the whole energy story, because we still have transportation powered by fossil fuels, gasoline. We still have industry making products using heat, maybe often usually using heat that comes from the burning of fossil fuels, and we heat our buildings with oil and gas. So uh, by 2050, the state plans that 85% of all energy used in the state of all forms would be carbon free, and the remaining 15% we would make up with some kind of offset. And the Climate Action Council, which met for 2 years to develop a plan to achieve this, called the Scoping Plan, declared that wind, water, and sunlight will power most of New York's economy. That is, the state's plan is built on renewable energy: wind power, solar photovoltaic power, and water power. So that's our framework. If you look at what the state's plan is, here's what it would look like by 2040, which is what my focus is going to be on. That is getting the grid free of, of fossils by fossil fuel, burning of fossil fuels by 2040. The following 10 years will be spent converting everything else from the burning of fossil fuels to electricity. That's the plan, is to electrify everything. That, in fact, is worldwide. That is the way the decarbonization is viewed, as electrify everything. I think there are serious questions about that, but that's a discussion for another time. So by 2040, the state's plan envisions 40,000 megawatts, or 40 gigawatts of uh, solar power. That's 10 times what we now have. What we now have is mostly on rooftops, very little so far in the form of um, industrial scale or utility scale solar farms, and this is a picture of the main only one that existed until this year, when one or two have been built upstate. This is one that Brookhaven National Laboratory built out on Long Island. Then, let's see. Okay. Um, Land-based wind power would expand to 7,500 megawatts from the current 1,800. Um, and finally, and very importantly, uh, the offshore wind, that is wind out in the ocean, would expand from none today in New York State to, or off of New York State, to 14,000 megawatts by 2040 and much more by 2050. The reason this is important is that there's no room in downstate New York for building much solar or wind on land. And so most of the power in this model, in this vision of the state is currently working on, most of the power for downstate New York, which is New York City, metropolitan area around it, and Long Island, would come from power from offshore wind. And finally, there'd be storage, a vast expansion of storage which doesn't exist today, except in very, very small amounts. This is an example of a storage farm in California. It's the first big one built there. Had some problems with fires and things, but I think it's now close to functioning. It's in Northern California. However, the report from the Climate Action Council does note that wind, water, and sunlight won't do the job. This is a quote from page 13, if you like, of the report from the Climate Action Council. The goal of emission-free electricity by 2040 requires between 15 and 45 gigawatts of electricity from zero-emission dispatchable resources like storage or nuclear power. This is the only mention of nuclear power in their report. There's no plan to expand nuclear power at all. But there is a need for this source, and it's a very large source. It's, in fact, 45 gigawatts is much more than all the fossil fuel resources we now have. Why do we need it? Well, let me go on and explain that. What's behind this sentence? Well, this is the conventional explanation. It's what's often referred to as Dunkelflaut, which is German. You will know what it means. It's dark doldrums. It's a situation where you have overcast skies, so there's little or no solar energy, and there's a lull in wind. There's no wind blowing. In Europe, this could go on for a week or two and be very broad over a large area of Europe, which means that if you're relying on solar and wind, you're out of luck. Now, if you have batteries that have been charged up ahead of time and that can produce power over periods of days or weeks, you'd be okay, but that's very, very difficult and hugely expensive because batteries don't, basically they're material intensive and very costly. So this is the conventional reasoning, and the reasoning then that's in the Climate Action Report for why you need this zero emission dispatchable source, what will refer to as a DEFR, dispatchable emission-free resource. Dispatchable means it will respond to the demands for electricity that the grid faces. So you can increase it, whatever this resource is, it can put out the power that's needed to keep the lights on. That's the simple definition. Solar and wind are not dispatchable. They depend on the weather. People refer to them as intermittent or weather dependent, but not dispatchable. The grid operator in New York is called NISO. They can dispatch power from various sources. They regulate the grid, but they can't dispatch solar and wind if the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. So that's the explanation. This is the scenario. This is the plan that the state has put forward from today, 2020, when the report was prepared, to 2050, and you can see that it calls for a very large expansion of the of solar. That's the yellow, of course. The wind is above it, then storage, and down at the bottom is this orange. That's the zero. That's the DEFR. and it's quite large. But that was the capacity. What I just showed you was the capacity. Let me go back again. So that's megawatts. The units here are megawatts. This is the actual output, megawatt hours. And you can hardly see the orange there. It's very small. And in fact, the uh, state estimates the plan that was put forward estimates that it will only be used 2% of the time. So you have to build this very large resource, which is going to be very expensive. I mean, it's some kind of power plant that can equal or exceed the output that we now get from fossil fuels, but uh, you only use it a small amount of the time. Um, doesn't seem like a very efficient system. Um, but this is the state's current plan. Um, NISO also has a plan to meet the goals of CLCPA, and it's quite different. It has the DFR up there. You can see it's in the gray dashed line, and they project that it will be required to produce 10% of the power that will be needed in 2040 overall, over the course of a year, 10% of the output. Very different from 2%. Um, Now, clearly, people are using different models. So there are questions, a series of questions here. I'll try to answer them. How did they get this result? Is this the most cost effective approach with a large dispatchable source that is seldom used? What will it cost ratepayers and taxpayers? And I sort of hasn't answered these questions. They don't show you the model. What they show you is what I just showed. That is, they show the annual output, the capacity, the size of the power plants that are needed, and then what their overall output for the year is. They don't show you how they will actually work over the course of the year or what they will actually cost to ratepayers and taxpayers, which are often, of course, the same people, but we're partly paying for power through our electric bills, and we're partly paying for it through state taxes, which are particularly subsidizing solar and wind today. So let me go now. What I've done is use a different model which will answer these questions, which will show exactly how the grid is working, how the different sources are being used, and what they will cost. The model was developed by these two engineers in Massachusetts. Rainer Kohr is a retired engineer with nearly 50 years of experience building power plants. Ahmad Nofal actually works for X Energy, which is a new nuclear startup building a small modular reactor, and he did the programming. And Kohr did the conceptualizing and the assembly of the data. And they made it available to me to convert it in a form that can be used in New York. So here's a schematic of how it works. You enter the data for a standard year, and I'm using the most recent year for which I had data, which is 2022. And what I used is the load over the course of the year, hour by hour. There's 8,760 hours in a year. So I give that NISO publishes all this data. How much the electric load it was in 2022, how much solar energy there was every hour, how much land-based wind there was, and then NISO now has provided us with data on what the offshore wind was, even though there were no turbines out there. There are devices out in the water measuring the wind, and they've assembled that data so we have hourly data that is put into the model. And we then assume that the weather is the same for every year between now and 2040. And we then project the load. We add to it the electrification expected from the growing number of electric vehicles and the electrification being mandated by the state for the heating of buildings. So the electric load grows between now and 2040, particularly in the winter, and particularly at night, because people drive their cars home and then charge them up overnight, and they heat their homes, and they heat their homes, more at night than in the daytime. In the daytime, they're often not there, or the sun is shining, but at night they need them. So you go from what's today a summer peaking system to a winter peaking electric grid. Then we take that 2022 data, we project it to 2040, and we calculate how the grid operates for every hour of the day in 2040 using the weather data based on 2022. So there'll be more sun in the summer, of course, no sun at night. There'll be wind that'll fluctuate with lulls at times and so on. And we'll use that weather data as our sample data. From that, we then get an annual analysis. How much was each source used, and what did it cost? We use the current cost projected to 2040, so there's some improvements in some savings, but some things will cost more as there's more pressure on the materials because more people will be building more batteries and more solar panels. And we then display it, and I will show you the displays, which to me are the key to understanding the results. So let me compare this with the model that was used to calculate the graphs I showed you earlier for the state's plan. That is a model, it's called Resolve. It's run by a consulting firm which the state hired based in California called E3. And it's an optimization model. What it does is it sums the energy use over every year up through 2050 and calculates what, with assumed costs for solar and wind. It didn't allow any nuclear to grow. It allowed existing nuclear to be retained, but not any to grow. And it then calculated what's the combination that produces the least cost as seen from today, what's called the net present value. That's very different from what the CACI model that I'm using does, which calculates for a given year, calculates the actual use hour by hour of each of the systems and shows them to you. So that's what I'm going to show you. Here's the situation in 2022. This is a graph from January 1st on the left to December 31 on the right. And the way I suggest reading this graph is starting at the bottom. The legend is on the right and tells you what each of the colors mean. Start at the bottom, you have hydropower, which is relatively constant. Then you have the existing nuclear plants which are located on Lake Ontario. That's the green. Then you have some imported power, which we assume that we can continue to import some power, some from Canada and some from surrounding states. That's the purple. Then there is solar rooftops. Rooftop solar is the yellow there. And that's the small amount of solar we have today. And then there's a small amount of wind. And finally, the black is the burning of gas, fossil fuels. And the peaks in the summer are shown there. That is, the basic our plants are what's called combined cycle. They're very efficient combined cycle plants. The peaker plants are less efficient. You can see the peaks there in the summer. So that's our base year, 2022. And this table shows the use of each of the sources in there. and how much they're used. Um, Here's the scenario that the state is proposing. What I'm going to do is use this model to see how would the state's plan work. And so in the red rectangle, I've shown the sources that are in the most popular scenario that NYSERDA presented, which is the state's Energy Research and Development Authority. They presented 4 scenarios. The most popular one is this one. It's accelerated decarbonization. Um, and these are the sources. And what we find is that we need a defer. We need a dispatchable source, a dispatchable emission-free source. It has to be 29,000 megawatts, just as NYSERDA, the Climate Action Council's report said we need a very large dispatchable source, but it runs 14% of the time, 14.4% of the time, and meets 15% of the load. That's very different than 2%. With 2%, you might say, and people have already said, some people already said, well, at 2%, let's not worry about it. You'll burn some gas. It won't produce much climate effect at 2%. But at 14%, you're getting to have a real impact on the climate and real expense in terms of providing the fuel. So is this really the most cost-efficient method? The cost of it down here is $238 per megawatt hour, or 23 cents per kilowatt hour. That's the wholesale cost. Compared, I didn't point that out, back there, the 2022 figure was $88. So the electric costs more than double in order to achieve this plan. It goes from 88 to 238. So here's the defer that I'm using. That is, what is this defer? I had to put something in there in the model to be able to calculate how it would function and what it would cost. This is the Natrium reactor being developed by TerraPower and GE Hitachi. It's a reactor. Each unit is 345 megawatts. Connected, the reactor produces heat, produces a hot fluid. It's usually a hot molten salt, and that hot fluid flows over and is stored in a tank. The hot fluid then heats water, produces steam, and the steam goes into a turbine, produces electricity. And because the source of heat is separated, that is, the reactor is separated from the storage system, you can produce the hot salt continuously. Reactors work best and most efficiently when you just keep them running steadily. But you can vary the output depending on what the need is of the grid. So this is a dispatchable nuclear reactor system. And this is what the model I used for the 29,000 megawatts of power that's needed for the defer. So this is the key graph in everything I'm talking about and will show you. And it's crucial that you and everybody else understand this graph. And I'm going to do the same thing, just go from the bottom up. This is the result of running the state's plan with the defer that they call for. They recognize it's needed, but it's not just needed when there's no sun and no wind. It's needed basically every night during the winter and some nights during the summer. So let's go the same way. Go start up from the bottom. There's hydropower, then there's existing nuclear, then there's the purchasing from other areas around. Then there is the rooftop solar. Then there is the dark blue is offshore wind, fluctuating a lot. In fact, by the way, this is a 7-day averaging to make it easier to read. I will show you in a second without what it looks like without the averaging. So that's offshore wind. Then the light blue is onshore wind. Then I don't know what to call it, orange, maybe that's utility scale solar. That's the big 40,000 megawatts of solar that is in the plan. Then there's a dark purple. That's batteries being called on because the solar and wind aren't enough. But finally, you have that turquoise. That's the defer. That's a dispatchable emission-free source, and you see, it's not just needed 2% of the time. It's needed every time, basically every day, except in periods in the springtime when the demand is low. Uh, Even in July, you need it because there are times in the evening when the demand for electricity, people are running their air conditioners at night. You need electricity, but there's no wind, and the DEFRA has to provide it. Then you keep going. The dark line is the load that has to be met, but above the load is some red, dark red. That's charging the batteries. That is, you have excess solar and wind, uh, particularly in the middle of the year, and that's used to charge up the batteries. And then finally, there's the dashed red. That's excess solar, particularly in the springtime, solar and wind, excess that isn't needed and it's curtailed. That's the technical term for it. Basically, the wind blows, but you can't use, we don't have any use for the power, and the batteries are already charged up. So, and there are a lot of batteries in the state plan, 20,000 megawatts worth of battery storage. um, so, and now, particularly in the wintertime, you can see from January to March, there's a very large use of the DEFR, and again in November and December, because you have heating of buildings in the wintertime by 2040. You've electrified a lot of buildings, particularly the newer ones, and you need that power. And there's not enough there in the solar and wind, even though you've had an enormous expansion of it. This is what it looks like without the averaging. Um, the daily fluctuations in the wind, particularly, are enormous. But you see the same picture. It's just a little harder to read because it's so much variation from day to day. Okay, so that's the situation with the state's plan. Here you can look hour by hour, and so here's January 1st. I assume, just arbitrarily, the batteries are all charged on at midnight on January 1st of 2040, but within 4 hours they're all discharged. There isn't enough solar and wind to meet the demand, particularly of heating and of charging up the automobiles, the electric vehicles. So we've used up the batteries, and you have to resort to the DEFR. So you turn on whatever it is. In this case, it's a proposed nuclear plant or a series of nuclear plants. It's a lot of those natriums. It's 29,000 megawatts of them, and you run it for the rest of the day. There's very little sun on January 1st, and very little wind in this particular day. You could look at any day in the year with this model. Here it's July, very different picture. The batteries you see are used and then charged, and midday they're charged, but there's also excess, particularly excess solar energy. Then the batteries are charged again in the afternoon. The batteries discharge. I'm sorry, the batteries discharge to help meet the load, so you don't need the DEFR on this particular day. This is July 1st of 2040. Here's a summer day. This is August 2nd. This is a summer day when there's very low wind, and you need the DEFR. So it's not just in the wintertime. It's also in the summer when you have lulls particularly in the evenings in wind. You have very little offshore or onshore wind, and so You have to first call on the battery. You see what you have there. The batteries is charged around noon. Then the batteries are discharged and they run out. Then you have to turn on the defer. Okay. Um, let me go back. Here's the numbers. The defer is used, as I showed you earlier, 14% of the time, and provides about 16% of the power. It's used nearly half the year. This is called the load duration curve. This on the scale along the bottom is the hours, the 8,760 hours. And you can see for about half of them, the defer is used because the solar, wind, and batteries aren't sufficient. So this is a source that has to do a lot of work, but not all the time. And as I said, reactors are most efficient if you use them all the time. Once they're hot, you want to keep them going and use the heat usefully. So this is again, there's this winter gap that is has to be filled by this defer, and you can see how large it is. It's a substantial gap. Here's where it comes from. You can see it if you go back and look. It's not invisible, and people haven't noticed it up until now. This is a graph from NISO, a projection of what will happen on a January night in 2042. And what it does is to combine the existing base load plus electric heating plus electric vehicles, and you get the blue graph at the top. This is 24 hours. The use drops during the day. The demand drops during the day. This is, well, because people aren't at home. And then the demand rises in the evening. People come home, they start cooking, they turn on their dishwasher, they turn on their clothes washers, so on. They watch television, so on. So that's their forecast for 2040. How well does the system meet it, given what the state is proposing? Well, here's the hydropower, here's the nuclear power, here's the maximum wind power at night. I'm leaving solar out because it's not available at night. So here's the maximum wind power. You only have maximum rarely. The average offshore is 45% of the maximum, and onshore it's 25% of the maximum. So you seldom have, but even with the maximum, there's a gap between what the system can provide and what the grid operator says is going to be needed. So that's the gap, and it's filled with some defer, and I'm suggesting it's going to be filled with a nuclear plant because there isn't anything else, any other technology that's capable of providing that amount of output. But can we do it more efficiently than the state? Remember, it costs $238 per megawatt hour in the state's plan. Here's an alternative. I call it Brighter Future. It adds some new base load new nuclear, that's this light green, and shrinks the solar and wind to 20% of what the state is proposing to build, and uses the same defer as before. So we meet all the load. And what's the cost? Here's the cost. It's $175. We've reduced the cost by maybe about 30% by reducing the amount of solar and wind and introducing some base load nuclear power, just like we have today on the Lake Ontario. I show the new nuclear in this blue oval here. But let's go further and let's eliminate the offshore wind. Why do I do that? Because, and I've written the op-ed on this, the offshore wind can't be relied on. During the summer, we know that storms come up through the Atlantic Ocean, and every time a storm comes up, whether it's a big hurricane or just a lot of wind, the wind turbines have to shut down to protect themselves from damage. They're programmed to shut down. So the city will go black unless you have a defer there to take over from the offshore wind. And it turns out it's cheaper to to eliminate the offshore wind and just have some onshore wind and some solar, because this system charge costs 150. It saves $25 per megawatt hour by eliminating the offshore wind. It adds cost and no value. So the major lessons from this model of the grid are: one, there's a giant gap in the state's planning for decarbonization. They accept the need for a defer, but say it's only needed 2% of the time, when in fact it's needed basically 1 out of every 7 days. On average, it's needed, but it's needed half the time. And if you run it more, let me go back a second here. You can see it's run 30% of the time in this Brighter Future 2 model. The more you run it, the more efficient the system gets, because the reactor is there, and having it sitting unused wastes money and energy. All right, so second, electrification requires a large, firm, dispatchable source during most of the year by 2040. Nuclear power can provide this in a reliable and affordable basis. And building large-scale renewables is wasteful and unnecessary. We've reduced the most efficient model we're showing here has no offshore wind and only 20% of the planned onshore wind and solar. And yet it costs about 50%, about half of what the state's plan will cost. So here's my paper and a one-page version of it with graphs. And I thank you for watching.